Brad Nelson, for those of you who don't know me. I think this is my third time here in the last year, but just a little bit about me. I was a pastor for 20 years, 10 years in Michigan, 10 years in Florida, and now I work with my best friend with this organization in Nashville called Walking the Text, and we basically believe that the Bible is the most compelling story in the world, and that there are all these people who want to center their lives around it, but the minute they try to, they find that it's confusing. They hit Leviticus, and it's like running into a wall. And so what we do is we lead study trips to Israel. We create resources to help people learn how to read the Bible in its original context so that it just explodes with new meaning. And part of that work is I get to build relationships with really, really great communities like yours. And I said this last time I was here, I'll probably say it every time I come here, but you know, when you're a speaker, you sort of do the circuit, and it can start to feel really transactional, but this place is different. Because there are people whose faces I know, whose stories I know, and when I come here, it's like just catching up with friends. In fact, I almost talked to my way. I almost missed my entrance to the service because I was back John with Dwight. So thank you for having me back. It's good to be with you guys. And I'm excited to continue this series, God _, and it turns out how you fill that blank reveals a lot about the kind of person that you're becoming. The author A.W. Tozer once wrote that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Because, he goes on to say, by some secret law of the soul, we become like the image of God that we have in our minds. So if you are thinking about an angry God, a God who's watching everything you do and constantly keeping score, then it shouldn't be surprising that you're struggling with anger and constantly keeping score, because we become like that image that we have in our minds. And so before we jump into the text today and explore what it means that God provides, that God is a good provider who gives us enough, I want to bring you to a place, because there is a place in the world and you can see it on a map from outer space, and it's a place where there is a stark contrast in the landscape, where the green ends and the brown begins, where there is abundance and just plenty, and then you cross this threshold and immediately you are in the brown, you are in the place of scarcity. And how many of you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that this is not just a place on a map, it's a place in the human heart? Any of you made this journey before? Guy goes into work on Friday, gets called into the boss's office in the afternoon. He says, this is gonna be your last day here. Give us your keys and your passwords. You've got 20 minutes to clean out your desk. And when he gets in the car to drive home, physically, he's in the car driving home. But mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, he's leaving the place of abundance and he's driving into the place of scarcity. It's the woman who was married to the love of her life for 40 years. And now, after the cancer, when she sits down every night at the dinner table, she looks across the table at an empty space. And if you were to glance around the room, you'd see pictures and all this evidence of a rich life, an abundant life of goodness, of love, of memories, and now there's just this emptiness. And as she sits there night after night, she feels that absence in her bones. And it's like every time she comes to the dinner table, it's this journey from abundance to scarcity, and we make this journey sometimes. And this is exactly the place where we find the Israelites in Exodus chapter 16. We'll pick up the story there. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. And if we locate this on a map, you can see here, you've got the land of Egypt there that's so green, and that is the Nile River that snakes down out of the mountains, heads toward the Mediterranean. You can just see how lush it is. In fact, a number of researchers believe that there is about 30,000 times more water available along the Nile River than there is in the land of Israel. So this is a place of fertility and of abundance. And this is where God's children, the Israelites, are enslaved to Pharaoh. And so God raises up this liberator, Moses. God does battle with Pharaoh, and he draws his people out of slavery through the waters of the Red Sea, and he's going to lead them to the promised land. There's just one problem. When you look at this map, if God is leading them to the promised land, does any of this not compute? Because we know that the promised land is in the opposite direction, and they're going in a different direction. And what's even odder is that there was a road at this time called the Way of Horus, or the Horus Road. It was a straight shot from Egypt into the promised land. It took you maybe about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. But God takes them a different route. And the text actually explains to us why. If you go back a couple chapters earlier into Exodus 13, this is what you'll read. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. God knows his people are skittish, so he takes them the long way. Question, has God ever taken you the long way? There are these moments when God has to do something in us to remove what's there and instill something new. And God has a big plan. He's got a big mission for these people in the land of promise, but he knows they've just spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt. The pastor and author Pete Scazzaro puts it this way: Jesus may live in your heart, but Grandpa lives in your bones. You don't unlearn 400 years of generational trauma overnight. And God says, if I'm going to take you to this land to be my representatives, to be a people of responsibility, I got to take you somewhere to unlearn that servitude mentality. I got to remove the Egypt out of you, and I got to put something else in you. It's like God takes us to these places to reveal what needs to go and to expose what needs to grow. And that's what happens on this journey. And so what we're going to see for them is that God is going to take them on a journey. And as we've already explored, they're going to leave this. This is what they leave behind. And if you read about the land of Egypt in the book of Deuteronomy, what you'll read is something like this. The land I am taking you to, the promised land, is nothing like Egypt. In Egypt, when you wanted to water your vegetable garden, you stuck your heel in the ground and dug it through the mud, and the floodwaters of the Nile would flow into your vegetable garden and water it. And when it was well watered, you'd take your heel and put it back in place. I mean, it's that verdant, that abundant, that lush. But the land I'm taking you to, it's a land that drinks rain from heaven. It's a land where you're going to have to look around at the brown, and you're going to have to trust that I'm going to provide for you. So God takes them out of this landscape, and in Exodus 16, he brings them to this landscape. Nothing, rocky, fierce. This is the kind of place where you're just trying to make it through the day. You're not thinking so much about tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, in order to go from Goshen to here, you've got to pass through this space. And this is where things are going to get really hairy for the Israelites. So we read in Exodus chapter 16, verses 2-3, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Now, any parents of teenagers in the room? Okay, we have multiple teenagers in our home, which means we field regular complaints about the food. And it turns out that when you translate this passage from Hebrew into teenager, it reads something like this. In the desert, the whole teenager community grumbled against Moses' mom and dad and said, bruh, I'm like starving. There's like low-key nothing to eat. I mean, this is like a regular weekly occurrence in our home. And what's funny is when you read through the Torah, you'll find these moments where Moses kind of loses it. And he says to God, God, I don't know what to do with these people. Did I give birth to them? Are they my children? I mean, he sounds like the parent of a teenager who's just putting up with complaints about the food. And notice how God responds. God says, there we are. The Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. Just enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. Now, this is important to understand. God tests his chosen ones. God really does have a plan and a purpose on your life. If you are a human being, you've been put on this earth to reflect his goodness and glory to the world so that the world flourishes. But more personally, your unique gifts, skills, abilities, limitations, God means to use those things in unique ways to do something big in the world. And because God has those kinds of plans for you, like any good teacher, he's going to test the people that he's chosen. He tests Abraham about Isaac. He tests his children here in the wilderness. He's going to test Jesus in the wilderness. And God's going to test us because what a test does at bottom is it exposes where you're at and it reveals what's needed for you to move forward, what's needed for you to advance. And so God brings them out here, and what's the test? Well, it turns out, if you read a little further down into Exodus 16, the text gives us a description of this bread from heaven. It's like coriander seed, it's flaky. And I learned this week that if you copy paste what is in Exodus 16 as a description of manna and you drop it into AI, this is what it looks like. It's like these flakes that show up on the desert floor and you gather up enough of them, you can turn it into bread. And I've always imagined, we don't know for sure, but I've always imagined that it probably tasted something a little bit like this. It's like when you take styrofoam, you mix it with sugar and you throw it in the oven. And here's the interesting thing. We know from hindsight that God is going to provide this for them every single day for 40 years. We know that. They didn't. And so the test is, hey, each morning, I want you to go out and gather what? Enough. I want you to gather just enough for that day. And Moses gives two stipulations. If you read through the story, the stipulations are this, that when you go out, don't keep any of it until morning. Don't try to store it up and hoard it so that you've got more and more and more. Just take what you need for today and trust that it will be there tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, on the Sabbath, remember, God wants us as a people to rest on the Sabbath, so don't go out looking for it on the Sabbath because you aren't going to find any. And what do the people do? They try to keep it overnight, and when the Sabbath comes, they're out there looking for it. And Moses is just like, what is wrong with you people? And here's my question, and I really believe that this is not just a question about ancient Israelites. I think it's a prophetic question about what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the most wealthy culture that has ever existed on the face of this earth. And here's the question. Why do they keep on gathering when they don't need to? Why do they keep running themselves ragged, trying to acquire more, when they've got a God who says, I will be there for you tomorrow like I was there for you today? Why? Why do we do this? And the short answer is they don't trust him, and God knows it. So what he does is he brings them out to the wilderness. He says, I'm gonna turn you into a people who trust me tenaciously. And in order to do that, don't gather more, just gather enough for today. And it turns out that trust is really about consistency over time. It's a couple, husband and wife group of therapists named John and Julie Gottman. Some of you may be familiar with their work, but they are widely considered to be some of the greatest relationship therapists in the United States. And they have studied the science of trust with couples, tens of thousands of couples. And what they have discovered about trust is that trust is not built through grand one-time gestures. It's built by the accumulation of a bunch of little, small moments. And they call these sliding door moments. And so John Gottman gives the example this way. Imagine that he is laying in bed reading a book, and he's about to go to sleep probably in the next 10 minutes, and he's got like 2 pages left in the chapter. And he really wants to get the chapter done before he goes to sleep, but he notices, oh, I'm out of water. I want to go refill my water before I go to bed. So he sets the book down. He walks down the hallway, past the bathroom door, on his way to the kitchen. But while he goes past the bathroom door, he can see in his peripheral vision, his wife is standing in front of the bathroom mirror with tears streaming down her face. And he says, in that split second, you have a decision to make. You can table your agenda and turn aside and say, babe, what's wrong? What's going on? And be there for your wife. And if you do, you've said yes to that sliding door moment. And when you say yes to that sliding door moment, it's like taking a marble and dropping it in the jar. And the more of those little sliding door moments you accumulate, the more trust builds up in a relationship. But the opposite is also true. If you choose to walk past the bathroom door, you see that your wife is not okay, but you still follow your own agenda, get your water, finish your chapter, and then hope the moment is still there, usually it's gone, and you've missed it. And here's the thing, when you miss those sliding door moments, they're not devastating to the relationship. But when you miss enough of them, each time you walk past, you remove a marble from the jar. And what the Gottmans have discovered is that things like infidelity and divorce very often are not the result of somebody waking up one morning and making a horrible decision. The horrible decision is the culmination of a lot of small decisions where you walked past the sliding door moment and then that marble jar got so depleted that it didn't take much for the thing to break. And God is basically doing this with his people in the desert. He's saying, listen, every day I need you to trust me. Trust me, I will provide for you. You will have enough for today. I will be there for you tomorrow like I was there for you today. But how many of you know exactly what I mean when I say you don't have to be an ancient Israelite to struggle with that test? I mean, this is the life we live at a cultural level. We are some of the wealthiest people to ever walk this planet. But how many of you find yourself on a daily or weekly basis losing sleep and losing time worrying about what you don't have? I would refer to this as a liturgy of lack. It's a woman named Lynn Twist. She wrote a book called The Soul of Money. It's probably the best book I've ever read on money and our relationship to it. And in the book, she describes our culture's relationship with scarcity. And she says this, I think it's so insightful. Our first waking thought of the day is, I didn't get enough sleep. The next one is, I don't have enough time. Whether true or not, the thought of not enough occurs to us automatically before we even think to question or examine it. We spend most of the hours and days of our lives hearing, explaining, complaining, and worrying about what we don't have enough of. Before we even sit up in bed, before our feet touch the floor, we're already inadequate, already behind, already losing, already lacking something. Any of you find something on that list that you felt already this morning? Getting out the door to church on a Sunday morning tends to elicit these kinds of thoughts in us. And it's not just economic. Some of you will be familiar with the name Brené Brown. Brené Brown is a shame researcher, and what she has found after working with thousands and thousands of people on the topic of shame is that at the heart of shame is this pervasive sense of never enoughness, that people don't feel pretty enough, accomplished enough, connected enough, successful enough. And it is this weird paradox that we live in the land of abundance, and yet we are riddled with a mentality of scarcity. And it doesn't help that we live in a consumer culture that's constantly stoking the fires of never enoughness with marketing that is painstakingly crafted to make you feel like your life is not okay. You don't have everything you need. You're not whole. But for 3 easy payments, you can be. I want to give you an example of this. This is a well-known national commercial campaign that played a number of years ago that you'll probably recognize. But I want you to listen for the tagline of this commercial campaign. So let's watch this together.
Who thinks more is better than this? Okay, well.
More is better. Friends, that's the message that's beat into our minds daily. And I'm here to tell you that's a lie. And what happens is when that message gets put into you, beat into you constantly, is you start to believe it. And it starts to shape how you see the world. It starts to shape how you see yourself. It starts to shape how you see your neighbor. And so about 20 years ago, I was speaking at a church in Southeast Michigan. And before I got up to speak, the church was doing a ministry highlight, and they had invited one of the family members in the church who had been actively involved in the foster care system. And she came up to share their story of how they had brought this foster daughter into their home. And she said, I knew we had a real problem on our hands when, in the first couple of weeks, I made cupcakes for all the kids. And like a mom, everybody had their own cupcake, and I served everybody else. I turn around to, put the dish towel back where it goes, and I turn back around to the island to get my cupcake's missing. We start looking around, and we can't find our foster daughter. 15 minutes later, after a house-wide search, they open a closet, and there's their foster daughter standing in the closet with tears streaming down her face and both cupcakes stuffed into her mouth. Because when you are scripted in scarcity, you start to believe there won't be enough for tomorrow, so I better get mine today. I'm gonna get as much as I can. And what happens is you start to look at neighbors as competitors. You start to believe that we live in a world of limited good where there's only so much to go around. And actually, if there's only so much to go around, then I can't celebrate God's blessing on your life, because if God has blessed you, that means there's less for me. And so we start to become competitors. And this scarcity gets into us at this really, really deep level. And I just want to take the last few minutes of our time together this morning to challenge this idea that more is better and to expose it for the lie that it is. Because friends, more is not better. God is. God is enough. He can be trusted to provide for you, and his provision today is the surest indicator of his provision for you tomorrow. And so here's what I have experienced in life. How many of you in this room have been on a short-term mission trip or have spent time overseas in an impoverished area? So when I was in college, each year I would travel with a group of students down to this orphanage in Chihuahua, Mexico. And the first time I was there, one of the children at this orphanage had a prized possession, and it was a soccer ball made out of rubber bands holding together plastic bags. And this soccer ball was this kid's pride and joy. You would think he was carrying around the Holy Grail. And it brought him so much joy. And I will never forget just being blown away by, wow, this kid has grown up in poverty, has never lived in abundance, and has just this one thing, and it brings so much joy. And then I remember coming back to the United States. And maybe you've had this experience where you see that in another setting, and then you come home and your kid is surrounded by toys and they're not interested in any of them. Not only are they not interested in any of them, they're almost like bored, almost irritated and grumpy. And what is it about having so much that gets in us and starts to shape us? Why can you have people who have so little and yet seem so full, and people who have so much and yet seem so empty? Because I'm here to tell you, there is such a thing as being well housed and yet being homeless. To have so much and yet lack. Now, how many of you have ever would confess to this? You've stood in front of a fully stocked refrigerator and you dared to utter the words, "There's nothing to eat here." We do this. How does this get into us? Now, some of you will recognize this face. This is Malcolm Gladwell. And about 10 years ago, he wrote one of the most creative and insightful books on the story of David and Goliath. And the book is called David and Goliath. And what he does is he shows how, not just in the David and Goliath story, but in life in general, many of the things that we perceive to be benefits or advantages actually turn out to be liabilities and disadvantages. And one of the core ideas that he talks about in this book is this thing called the inverted U. And the inverted U curve goes something like this. There is such a thing as not having enough. You can have not enough money. You can have not enough food. You can have not enough exercise or information. And if you don't have enough and then you get more of that thing, it will make you happier. But the flip side is true, that if you have enough money, food, exercise, and then you keep acquiring more of it, not only will it not make you happier, in some cases, it will decrease your satisfaction with life. In the words of the prophet, the notorious B.I.G., more money, more problems. And we experience this in so many ways. And for me, when I'm sitting down to prepare for a sermon, what often happens for me is I'll get out all the books. I want to read about the geography, the language, the culture, the history, what's happening. And it's really, really helpful as I gather all this information. If the teaching or the sermon doesn't have enough of that information, it's not substantive. So I got to have enough information. But there is a point where you can get too much information. And when you have too much information, you start to be paralyzed. Like, well, I don't know what this thing is. Is it about this, or is it about these other four things? And there comes a point where you have to make a choice. It's going to be about this, and this is the path we choose. A friend of mine by the name of Mark, this is a picture of us from about 10 years ago. He owned a film company and was doing really well for himself. And he had this opportunity to expand his film company into television. And I remember talking with him and listening to him think through, should I do this or shouldn't I? And the kind of influence that getting into television would give his film company would be massive, not to mention the economic gain from it. And so he made the decision to go after this. And when I connected with him about a year later, I said, hey man, how's it going? He said, well, we did it. We broke into television. We made a bunch of money. We've got all this influence. But can I just tell you, in order to make it happen, I had to spend 1 week out of every month away from my family in LA. I had to hire a bunch of staff to create overhead to pull it all off. Oh, and at the end of the year, I learned about this little thing called tax brackets. And when all was said and done, my wife was mad at me, my family life was stressful, and I actually made less money. And the whole point of the inverted U curve is that more is not better, enough is. And what God takes the Israelites to the wilderness to discover is enough. How do you begin to live from this place of enough? And friends, this wisdom is everywhere in the scriptures. You look into the book of Proverbs, there's this prayer by this guy named Agur. And he says, give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my what? Who's this sound like? Pray for daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. You get the Apostle Paul, who leaves sort of like everything behind to travel the world and start these Jesus communities. And as he does it, he says things like this: rather, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich. And I love this line so much: having nothing yet possessing everything. Friends, it is possible to have nothing and yet possess everything. And it is possible to have everything and yet possess nothing. And what enough does is it breaks you out of that trance of scarcity and moves you into this posture of sufficiency. And this is the wisdom of the Exodus story. Gather enough for that day. Turn your attention onto enough. So I want to invite our communion team to come forward and do their thing. And as they're doing that, I just want to leave you with 3 really concrete ideas about what it looks like to move out of a mindset of scarcity and into a mindset of sufficiency. And first thing is just simply this: the most often repeated command in the Bible, believe it or not, is to remember. Remember you were slaves in Egypt. Remember you were slaves in Egypt. Remember what I did for you. Remember how I showed up. And what I find to be true over and over again, when I meet people who have left the world of scarcity and are standing firmly in the place of sufficiency, they are the kind of people who tell stories over and over again about how God showed up in their life, about how God met their needs. I wish I could introduce my grandmother to you. She's 87 years old, and every time you're with her, you can guarantee you are going to hear the same stories over and over again. But what is so beautiful about it is that it is so obvious that when she tells these stories, she is going into the vault that is her heart and bringing out her most precious treasures. The ways that God has met her, the ways that God has been faithful, the ways that God has provided. When I was a little boy and I would come home from school, DuckTales was always on TV. Any of you remember DuckTales? There was one scene in every episode of DuckTales where Scrooge McDuck would go into the vault in his swimsuit and swim in his gold. Do you understand, friends, that when you tell and retell the stories of how God met you and provided for you, you're doing the same thing. Except you're not swimming in gold, you're swimming in stories of God's sufficiency. Because God's past faithfulness is the surest indicator of his future faithfulness. So, how do we move from that place of scarcity to this place of sufficiency? Well, first, it's remember. And second, it's bless. The writers of the Talmud made it so that every Jewish man and woman needed to bless God 100 times a day. Well, do you know what happens if you have to bless God 100 times a day? In order to hit your quotient, you basically got to wake up and start saying thank you. And the idea is the more you say thank you, the more likely it is that that thank you is going to transfer from your lips down into your heart. And what gets your attention is the surest indicator of who you become. In fact, the social sciences have sort of confirmed this. It's called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. And it goes something like this. Imagine that you really love vintage Volkswagen Beetles and that you really want a vintage Volkswagen Beetle. So you go out and buy one. And you drive this home proud because you're like, man, nobody has one of these. And you drive it around that week. And at the end of the week, what happens? You saw 7 of them. What the heck? And here's what has happened. Because you decided that this is important, you now see it everywhere where before your brain filtered it out. And friends, this is why gratitude is so crucial. When you choose to look at your life and say, thank you for what you do have, it's like God opens your eyes to see what you do have everywhere. But if you stand in the place of scarcity and you choose to look at your life through the lens of lack, only ever seeing what you don't have, well, brothers and sisters, that's what you start to see everywhere. Remember, bless. And the last thing is just give. Because the minute you choose to make a difference with what you do have, whether little or much. Remember, what does Peter say to the guy he heals? Silver and gold have I none, but what I do have, I give to you in the name of Jesus. Stand up and walk. Friends, when you choose to make a difference with what you have, God shows up and there is enough. So the next time you find yourself traveling through this landscape, I want to invite you to just say these words. God, I trust you. I trust you. You have been there for me. And then remember, bless, give, remember, bless, give, remember, bless, give.